The rain hammered against the kitchen window as Denise stirred the pot of gumbo, humming softly to herself. The aroma of okra, shrimp, and spices filled the air of their modest Atlanta home. She glanced at the clock. 6:30 p.m. Robert would be home from his construction job soon, probably tired and hungry like always. After 15 years of marriage, she knew his routines better than her own heartbeat. The house phone rang, cutting through her peaceful evening. Denise wiped her hands on her apron and picked up. "Hello." Heavy breathing filled the line, followed by a gravelly voice she didn't recognize. "Is this Mrs. Denise Crawford?" "Yes, who's calling?" "Listen to me very carefully. Your husband hired me to do something real bad to you. But I can't go through with it. You seem like a good woman from what I've been watching." Denise's wooden spoon clattered to the floor. Her heart started pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. What are you talking about?" "He paid me $5,000. Half up front, half when the job was done. Said he wanted it to look like an accident. But lady, I got daughters of my own. I can't do this to somebody's mama." The room started spinning. Denise gripped the counter to steady herself. "This has to be a mistake. My husband would never. Check his work truck tomorrow morning. Look under the driver's seat. There's an envelope with my contact information and photos of you. Pictures he took when you weren't looking. Your daily routine. Where you work, where you shop, when you leave the house." The gumbo started boiling over, but Denise couldn't move. She felt like she was drowning in her own kitchen. "I'm giving you a head start, Mrs. Crawford. That's all I can do. Be smart about what you do next." The line went dead. Denise stood there holding the phone, her whole body shaking. Outside, she heard Robert's truck pulling into the driveway, the same sound that had brought her comfort for 15 years. Now it made her want to run and hide. The front door opened. "Denise, baby, I'm home. Something smells good in here." Robert's voice, warm and familiar, floated from the hallway. The same voice that used to whisper sweet words in her ear. The same voice that sang along to old Luther Vandross songs while they cooked together on Sundays. Now it sounded like a stranger's voice to her ears. "Coming," she called out, surprised her voice worked at all. She turned off the stove and walked to the living room on unsteady legs. Robert was sitting in his recliner, pulling off his work boots. His dark skin was covered with construction dust, and his usually bright smile looked tired. He looked like the same man she'd fallen in love with at a church barbecue 20 years ago. But something cold had settled in her chest, making it hard to breathe. "How was your day, baby?" he asked, looking up at her with those deep brown eyes she'd once thought held nothing but love. "Fine," she managed. "Just fine." Robert studied her face. "You feeling all right? You look pale." She forced a smile. "Just tired. Long day at the school." Denise worked as a teacher's aide at the elementary school down the street. She loved working with the children, helping them learn to read, tying tiny shoes, and wiping away tears after playground accidents. The kids called her Miss D, and their bright faces were usually the best part of her day. "Well, come sit with me for a minute before dinner," Robert said, patting his lap like he always did. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she made herself walk over and perch carefully on the arm of his chair instead of his lap. She couldn't bear the thought of him touching her right now. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, reaching up to touch her forehead. She pulled back slightly. "I'm fine. Just need to check on dinner." Back in the kitchen, Denise's hands shook as she ladled gumbo into bowls. Her mind raced with questions that made her feel sick. How long had he been planning this? What had she done wrong? Was their whole marriage a lie? They ate dinner in silence, which wasn't unusual. Robert was often too tired after work to talk much. But tonight, every clink of his spoon against the bowl made her jump. When he complimented the gumbo, she nearly choked on her own bite. After dinner, Robert settled in front of the TV to watch the news while Denise cleaned the kitchen. She moved through the familiar motions of washing dishes and wiping counters, but her mind was far away. She kept thinking about that phone call. Could it be real? Could someone be playing a cruel joke on her? But who would know Robert's full name and her maiden name? Who would know they lived on Maple Street? The caller had mentioned specific details about her routine that only someone who'd been watching her would know. "I'm gonna turn in early tonight," Robert announced from the living room. "Got an early job site meeting tomorrow." "Okay," she called back. "I'll be up in a few minutes." She heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, then the sound of the shower running. For 15 years, she'd followed the same nighttime routine: finish cleaning, lock up the house, join him in bed. But tonight, she couldn't make herself move toward those stairs. Instead, she found herself looking around the kitchen with new eyes. The blue curtains she'd sewn herself. The family photos on the refrigerator. The cast iron skillet that had belonged to her grandmother. This had been her home, her safe place. Now it felt like a trap. When she heard Robert snoring from upstairs, Denise crept to the living room window and peered out at his work truck parked in the driveway. Tomorrow morning she would look under that driver's seat. Part of her hoped she'd find nothing. But a bigger part of her already knew the caller had been telling the truth. She spent the night sitting at the kitchen table watching the sun come up through those blue curtains, planning what she had to do next. By the time Robert's alarm went off at 6 a.m., Denise had made the hardest decision of her life. She was going to disappear. But first, she needed to find out exactly what kind of man she'd been married to all these years. She needed to see that evidence with her own eyes. And then she needed to vanish before Robert's deadline with his hired helper ran out. As she heard Robert moving around upstairs, getting ready for work, Denise allowed herself one last look around the kitchen where she'd made thousands of meals, celebrated birthdays, and dreamed of growing old. Then she steeled herself for what was coming next. She was about to find out if the man she'd loved for 15 years really wanted her dead. Robert left for work at 7:15 a.m., same as always. He kissed her forehead and told her to have a good day, same as always. But this time, when his truck disappeared around the corner, Denise was watching from behind the curtain with her heart hammering in her chest. She waited 15 minutes to make sure he wasn't coming back for something he forgot. Then she grabbed the spare key to his truck from the kitchen drawer and walked outside on shaking legs. The morning air was still cool, and Mrs. Henderson next door was watering her roses. She waved at Denise like every other morning, and Denise managed to wave back. Everything looked normal. Everything looked like the life she'd been living for the past 15 years. But nothing would ever be normal again. Denise unlocked Robert's truck and climbed into the driver's seat. The familiar smell of his cologne and coffee hit her, along with that dusty construction smell that clung to everything he owned. She'd always found it comforting before. Now it made her stomach turn. Her hands shook as she felt under the seat. At first she found nothing but some old receipts and a wrench. Hope flickered in her chest. Maybe this was all some terrible mistake. Maybe that caller had been lying or confused. Then her fingers touched something else. A manila envelope taped to the underside of the seat. Denise pulled it free and sat there staring at it for a long moment. Once she opened this, there would be no going back. No more pretending her marriage was what she thought it was. No more believing Robert loved her. She tore it open. Inside were photographs of her. Dozens of them. Pictures of her walking to her car in the morning. Coming out of the grocery store. Laughing with her coworker Brenda at the school playground. Sitting on the front porch reading a book. Some were taken from far away with a long lens. Others were closer, like someone had been following her. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note. Daily routine documented. Target isolated most mornings 8 to 9 a.m. walking to car. Best window for accident scenario. Vehicle impact driveway. Will look like backing out mishap. Denise dropped the photos like they were on fire. They scattered across the truck seat and floorboard. Dozens of images of her normal life, turned into something sinister. Someone had been watching her, studying her, planning her death like she was just a problem to solve. Her phone buzzed. A text from Robert. Forgot my safety glasses. Can you bring them to the job site? Love you. Love you. The words that used to make her smile now felt like a slap across the face. Denise gathered up the photos with trembling hands and put them back in the envelope. She needed to think clearly now. She needed to be smart like the caller had said. First, she drove to the bank. If Robert was planning to get rid of her, he might try to drain their accounts too. She withdrew $5,000 in cash from their savings account, exactly the amount the caller had mentioned. She closed their joint checking account and moved her half to an account with only her name on it. Next, she went home and called in sick to work. Principal Martinez was understanding when she said she had a family emergency. If only he knew how true that was. Denise spent the morning gathering important documents, her birth certificate, social security card, passport, and the insurance papers. She also packed a small bag with clothes and personal items, hiding it in the back of her closet behind some old boxes. The hardest part was going through their photo albums. 15 years of memories that had felt real just yesterday. Their wedding day when Robert had cried as she walked down the aisle. Vacations to Myrtle Beach. Christmas mornings. Her mother's funeral when Robert had held her while she sobbed. Had any of it meant anything to him? Or had he been planning this from the beginning? Around noon, she called her sister Pamela in Birmingham. They hadn't talked much since their mother passed 2 years ago. Pamela had always thought Robert was too controlling, and the tension had driven a wedge between the sisters. Denise? Girl, what's wrong? You sound terrible. Pam, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. What did you really think about Robert? Silence on the other end of the line. Then, why are you asking me this now? Please, just tell me. Pamela sighed. I always thought he was too possessive. The way he'd call you all the time when we were out together. How he didn't want you working full-time or having friends he didn't approve of. Remember when you wanted to go back to school to become a teacher? He talked you out of it, said the family needed you home. Denise's heart sank. She'd forgotten about that. She'd wanted to get her teaching degree, but Robert had convinced her they couldn't afford it. He'd said he wanted to take care of her, that she didn't need to stress herself with school. And there was something else, Pamela continued carefully. You remember his first wife, Cheryl? She died in a car accident before I met him. That's what he told you. But I heard different. I heard she left him, said he was scaring her. Then a few months later, she died when her brakes failed on the highway. The room started spinning again. Pam, why didn't you tell me this before? You were so happy. And it was just rumors. I didn't have proof of anything. But Denise, if something's happening now, I might need to come stay with you for a while. Of course, you're always welcome here. But what's going on? Denise looked around her kitchen at the life she'd built with a man who apparently wanted her dead. I'll tell you when I get there. I might need to leave tonight. That's fine. I'll make up the guest room. After she hung up, Denise sat at the kitchen table and tried to make sense of everything. If what Pamela said was true, this wasn't Robert's first time. Maybe she wasn't the first wife he'd decided was inconvenient. Her phone rang. Robert again. Hey baby, I'm gonna be late tonight. Boss wants us to work overtime to finish this foundation. More time to plan her escape. Okay. I'll keep dinner warm. You feeling better? You sounded funny this morning. I'm fine. Just tired. Well, get some rest. I love you. There were those words again. Words that used to comfort her, now felt like poison in her ears. Love you too, she managed to say. After she hung up, Denise realized something that made her feel sick all over again. She'd been saying I love you back to him automatically, even knowing what she knew now. Even after seeing those photos, part of her was still trying to be the good wife he'd trained her to be. That night, she cooked Robert's favorite dinner, fried chicken, mac and cheese, and green beans, like nothing had changed. She set the table with their good dishes and lit the candles they usually saved for special occasions. If this was going to be their last dinner together, she wanted to remember every detail. When Robert got home, covered in concrete dust and tired from the long day, he smiled at the fancy table setting. What's all this for? Just felt like doing something nice, she said. They ate mostly in silence, but Denise found herself studying his face, looking for signs of the man who could hire someone to kill her. He looked tired and older than his 45 years, but he still looked like her Robert. The man who brought her flowers on Valentine's Day. The man who held her hand during scary movies. How could someone hide something so terrible behind such an ordinary face? After dinner, Robert fell asleep in front of the TV like always. And Denise, for the last time, cleaned their kitchen and got ready to disappear from the only life she'd known for 15 years. At 3 a.m., when Robert's snoring was deep and steady, Denise crept out of bed. She'd been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to him breathe. Every sound he made terrified her now. What if he knew she'd found the envelope? What if he was just pretending to sleep? But his breathing stayed even as she slipped from under the covers and padded barefoot to the closet. Her small bag was still hidden behind the Christmas boxes. She grabbed it and her purse, then stopped at the dresser to look at their wedding photo one last time. They looked so happy. Robert in his rented tuxedo, her in her grandmother's pearl necklace and the dress she'd saved for months to buy. She'd thought they would grow old together in this house. Now she was running away in the middle of the night like a criminal. Denise made her way downstairs, avoiding the creaky spots she'd memorized over 15 years. In the kitchen, she left a note on the table. Had to go help Pamela with an emergency. We'll call you later. D. It wasn't much of an explanation, but it might buy her some time before he realized she was really gone. She slipped out the back door and walked 3 blocks to where she'd parked her car earlier that evening. She'd told Robert she'd moved it because Mrs. Henderson was having her driveway redone and needed the space. Another lie to add to the growing pile. As she drove through the empty Atlanta streets toward Interstate 20, Denise couldn't stop checking her rearview mirror. Every pair of headlights made her heart race. But the roads were mostly empty at this hour, just her and the occasional semi-truck heading west. The drive to Birmingham usually took 2.5 hours, but tonight it felt like forever. Denise kept the radio off, afraid any sound might cover the noise of someone following her. Her hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel so tight. She stopped once for gas and coffee at a truck stop near the Alabama border. Under the fluorescent lights, she caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the frightened woman staring back. Her usually neat hair was wild, her eyes red from crying, her dark skin pale with fear. This wasn't who she was supposed to be. She was supposed to be home in her warm bed, sleeping next to her husband. She was supposed to wake up in a few hours and get ready for work, same as always. Instead, she was running for her life from the man she'd promised to love forever. Pamela lived in a small house in Birmingham's South Side, not far from the railroad tracks. When Denise pulled into the gravel driveway at 6:30 a.m., her sister was already waiting on the front porch with 2 cups of coffee. Pamela looked like an older, slightly rounder version of Denise, with the same high cheekbones and warm brown eyes their mother had given them both. But where Denise had always been the careful one, following rules and trying to please everyone, Pamela had always been the rebel. She divorced her husband years ago and raised her 2 sons on her own, working double shifts at the hospital to make ends meet. "You look like hell," Pamela said, wrapping her in a fierce hug. "I feel worse than I look," Denise whispered, and then she was crying again. Inside, over breakfast and more coffee, Denise told her sister everything. About the phone call, the photos under the seat, Robert's first wife. Pamela listened without interrupting, her face getting darker with anger by the minute. "That sorry piece of," Pamela caught herself. "I knew something was wrong with that man. I felt it in my gut from day one. Why didn't you say more? Why didn't you make me listen?" Pamela reached across the table and took her hand. "Baby, you were grown. And you seemed happy. I figured maybe I was wrong about him. Maybe I was just being overprotective after what happened with Mama and Daddy. Their father had been a mean drunk who'd made their mother's life miserable until the day he died. Denise had always sworn she'd never end up in that kind of marriage. But maybe she had, just with a different kind of danger. What am I going to do?" Denise asked. "I can't go home. I can't go back to work. He knows where all my friends live." "First, you're going to rest," Pamela said firmly. "Then we're going to figure out what comes next. But you're safe here, I promise you that." For the first time in 24 hours, Denise felt like she could breathe. Pamela's house was small but comfortable, filled with photos of her sons and the smell of the vanilla candles she loved. It felt like the complete opposite of the house she'd just fled. That afternoon, while Pamela was at work, Denise's phone rang. Robert's name flashed on the screen. She stared at it, paralyzed, until the ringing stopped. Then it started again immediately. This time she answered. "Denise? Thank God. I came home for lunch and found your note. What's wrong with Pamela? Is she okay?" His voice sounded normal, concerned, like the husband she'd thought she knew. For a second, she almost believed she'd imagined everything. Almost convinced herself to go home and pretend none of this had happened. She's having some problems. I need to stay here for a while and help her out." "How long is a while?" "I miss you already, baby." The endearment that used to make her smile now made her skin crawl. "I don't know yet. Maybe a few weeks." Silence on his end. Then, "A few weeks? Denise, you've got responsibilities here. Your job, the house. Me. You can't just run off to Birmingham every time your sister has drama." There it was. The controlling tone Pamela had mentioned. The voice that said he owned her, that her job was to stay home and be available whenever he needed her. "Pam really needs me right now," she said carefully. "And I need you too. I'm your husband. That should come first." "I know. And it does. But nothing. I want you home by tomorrow night, or we're going to have a serious problem." The threat in his voice was clear. Denise's hands started shaking again. "Robert, tomorrow night, Denise. I mean it." He hung up before she could respond. Denise sat holding the phone, her heart pounding. In 15 years of marriage, Robert had never spoken to her like that. He'd been controlling, but always in a subtle way. Sweet manipulation disguised as concern. This was different. This was the real Robert, the one who'd hired someone to kill her. When Pamela came home that evening and heard about the phone call, her eyes flashed with anger. "That settles it," she said. "You're not going anywhere near that man again. Tomorrow we're going to the police." But Denise shook her head. "With what proof? Those photos could have been taken by anyone. The phone call was anonymous. They'll think I'm crazy or paranoid. Then what are you going to do?" Denise looked out Pamela's kitchen window at the evening sky, thinking about the life she'd left behind. Her job at the school, her small circle of friends, the garden she'd spent years nurturing. Robert had taken all of that away from her without firing a single shot. "I'm going to start over," she said finally. "Somewhere he'll never find me. You can stay here as long as you need to." Denise squeezed her sister's hand. "I know. But Birmingham isn't far enough. He'll come looking for me here eventually." That night, lying in Pamela's guest room, Denise made plans. She had enough money to disappear for a while, maybe find work in another state. She'd always wanted to see the ocean. Maybe she'd go to Florida or California. Start fresh somewhere no one knew her story. It would mean giving up everything she'd ever known. But staying meant dying and running meant living. For the first time since that terrible phone call, the choice seemed clear. 3 months later, Denise stood on the beach in Savannah, Georgia, watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold. She'd never seen anything so beautiful in her life. The ocean stretched out forever, making her problems seem small in comparison. She'd been living in a small apartment near the historic district, working at a local elementary school under her maiden name, Denise Thompson. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been happy to hire someone with her experience, especially someone willing to work with the youngest children. The kids here called her Miss Thompson, and their bright faces still made her smile every morning. Some things never changed no matter how far you ran. But other things had changed completely. Denise had cut her hair short and lightened it slightly. She'd lost 15 pounds from stress and walking everywhere instead of driving. People who knew the old Denise might not recognize this new version. She'd been careful about covering her tracks. Paid cash for everything, used a prepaid phone, avoided social media completely. As far as she knew, Robert had no idea where she was. The first month had been the hardest. Every knock on her apartment door made her freeze in fear. Every stranger who looked at her too long made her wonder if Robert had found her. She'd barely slept, jumping at every sound. But gradually she'd started to relax. The people in Savannah were friendly but respectful of privacy. Her landlady, Mrs. Chin, was a sweet elderly woman who brought her homemade cookies and never asked too many questions about her past. Denise had even made a friend at work, another teacher's aide named Grace who'd moved to Savannah from Charleston after her divorce. Grace was a few years younger than Denise, with a laugh that could be heard 3 classrooms away and a talent for making everyone around her feel better. "Girl, you need to get out more," Grace would say whenever she invited Denise to join her for dinner or drinks. "All work and no play makes for a boring life." But Denise wasn't ready for a social life yet. She was still learning how to be herself again, without someone watching her every move or questioning her every decision. The freedom was almost overwhelming sometimes. She could eat breakfast for dinner if she wanted to. Could read romance novels without Robert commenting on how silly they were. Could wear bright colors instead of the muted tones he'd always said looked better on her. Small freedoms, but they felt huge after 15 years of marriage. Her phone rang as she walked back from the beach. Unknown number, which always made her nervous, but she'd been getting a lot of calls from parents about school events lately. "Hello? Denise Thompson?" The voice was unfamiliar, but something about the formal tone made her stomach clench. "Yes. This is Detective Williams with the Atlanta Police Department. Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about your husband, Robert Crawford." The world tilted sideways. Denise grabbed a nearby bench to steady herself. What about him?" "Ma'am, your husband was arrested yesterday on charges of conspiracy and attempted murder. We found evidence that he hired someone to harm you. We've been looking for you to get your statement." Denise sank onto the bench, her legs giving out. She'd known Robert was dangerous, but hearing it confirmed by the police made it real in a way that terrified her all over again. "Mrs. Crawford? Are you there?" I'm here. How did you find me?" "The man your husband hired came forward with evidence when you disappeared. He was worried something had happened to you. He helped us build a case against your husband, the mysterious caller who'd saved her life. He'd done more than just warn her, he'd made sure Robert would pay for what he'd planned. We need you to come back to Atlanta to testify, ma'am. But I want you to know, your husband can't hurt you anymore. He's being held without bail." Denise closed her eyes, feeling something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: relief. Real, deep relief that made her want to cry and laugh at the same time. "I'll come back," she said. "But I need a few days to arrange things here." "Of course. And ma'am, I'm sorry you had to go through this. No one should have to run from their own home." After she hung up, Denise sat on that bench for a long time, watching the waves and thinking about everything that had brought her to this moment. The phone call that changed her life. The terrible discovery in Robert's truck. The night she'd crept out of her own house like a thief. She thought about Robert sitting in a jail cell, finally facing consequences for his actions. Part of her felt sorry for him. 15 years of marriage didn't disappear overnight, even when that marriage had been built on lies. But a bigger part of her felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. That evening she called Pamela to tell her the news. "Thank God," her sister said, and Denise could hear tears in her voice. "I've been so worried about you. When are you coming home?" "I don't know if Atlanta is home anymore," Denise said honestly. "I built something here. Not much, but it's mine." "What about your job? Your house?" "Robert can keep the house. And there will be other jobs. Pam, for the first time in my adult life, I get to choose what comes next. That's worth more than any house." She told Grace about her situation the next day, expecting shock or judgment. Instead, Grace just shook her head. "Honey, I had a feeling you were running from something. You had that look, like a deer that's always watching for hunters. I'm just glad you got away. I have to go back for the trial. I might be gone for a while." Grace hugged her tight. "You do what you need to do. But you better come back to us, you hear? These kids love Miss Thompson, and so do I." A week later, Denise flew back to Atlanta. Pamela picked her up at the airport, and they drove through the city where Denise had lived most of her adult life. Everything looked smaller somehow, less threatening than it had in her memories. The trial lasted 3 days. Denise testified about finding the photos, about the anonymous phone call that had saved her life, about the years of subtle control she'd mistaken for love. It was hard to talk about her private life in front of strangers, but every word brought her closer to true freedom. Robert's lawyer tried to make it seem like she'd misunderstood everything, that Robert had just been worried about her safety. But the evidence was overwhelming. The photos, the recorded conversations with the hired man, the money trail. Even testimony from Robert's first wife's sister, who'd always suspected Robert had something to do with Cheryl's death. When the judge sentenced Robert to 15 years in prison, Denise felt the last chains around her heart finally break. 2 years later, Denise stood in the garden behind her new house in Savannah, harvesting tomatoes and okra for the gumbo she planned to make for dinner. Grace was coming over with her new boyfriend, and Mrs. Chun from next door always joined them for Sunday dinner. The house was small but perfect: 2 bedrooms, a sunny kitchen, and this garden that she'd planted from scratch. She'd bought it with money from selling the Atlanta house and her divorce settlement. Every flower, every vegetable, every blade of grass was hers by choice. She kept her maiden name in her new life. The school had made her a full-time teacher after she'd completed her education degree through night classes. The same dream Robert had talked her out of pursuing years ago was now her reality. Her students this year were first graders, and they kept her laughing with their innocent questions and boundless energy. Last week, little Marcus had asked her if she was going to get married again. "I don't know," she told him honestly. "Right now I'm happy just being me." And she was happy in a way she'd never been during her marriage. She'd learned to enjoy her own company, to make decisions without asking permission, to trust her own instincts. There had been a few dates over the past year: a kind widower from church, a fellow teacher Grace had tried to set her up with. Nice men who made her laugh and treated her with respect. But she wasn't ready for anything serious yet. Maybe someday, but not yet. Her phone rang as she was washing vegetables at the kitchen sink. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but she answered anyway. She wasn't afraid of phone calls anymore. "Miss Thompson? This is James Watson." The name didn't ring a bell. "Can I help you?" "I'm the man who called you 2 years ago. About your husband." Denise's hands stilled on the tomatoes she'd been washing. She'd wondered about this man many times, but never expected to hear from him again. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," he continued, "and to apologize again for the whole situation." "You saved my life," she said simply. "You have nothing to apologize for. I should have gone to the police from the beginning instead of getting involved in the first place. I was in a bad place then, needed money for my daughter's medical bills. But that don't excuse it. What made you change your mind? I followed you for a few days, took those pictures he wanted. Saw you working with those kids at the school, being kind to everyone you met. You reminded me of my daughter's teacher, someone who makes the world better just by being in it. I couldn't be part of hurting someone like that." Denise wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "How is your daughter?" "She's good. Real good. The treatments worked and she's been cancer-free for a year now. Starting high school in the fall." "I'm so glad. Miss Thompson? I heard your husband got 15 years. That enough to make you feel safe?" Denise looked out her kitchen window at the garden she'd planted, at the life she'd built with her own hands. "I've been safe for a long time now. But yes, knowing he's locked up helps." "Good. You deserve to be happy and safe." After she hung up, Denise stood in her kitchen thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought her here. Robert's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also freed her from a life that was slowly suffocating her. She thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, scared, controlled, living someone else's version of her life. That woman wouldn't recognize the Denise Thompson who now stood in this sunny kitchen, planning dinner for friends she'd chosen, in a home she'd bought, in a town she'd picked because she loved the ocean. Grace arrived an hour later with her boyfriend Tony and a bottle of wine. Mrs. Chin came through the back gate with fresh bread and her usual stream of neighborhood gossip. They sat on Denise's back porch as the sun set, eating gumbo and laughing at Tony's terrible jokes. "This is perfect," Grace said, squeezing Denise's hand. "Just perfect." And it was perfect in its own simple way. Not the fairy tale ending she'd once dreamed of, but something better. A real life built on her own terms, surrounded by people who cared about her for exactly who she was. Later that evening, after her friends had gone home and the dishes were washed, Denise sat on her front porch swing with a cup of tea. The night was warm and filled with the sound of crickets and distant ocean waves. She thought about writing in the journal she'd started keeping, another small freedom she'd given herself. Tonight she might write about gratitude, about second chances, about the phone call that had seemed like the end of her world but had actually been the beginning of her real life. A car drove slowly down her street, and for just a moment her old instincts kicked in. But then she recognized it as Mr. Peterson from down the block, coming home late from his shift at the hospital. She waved and he waved back, and the moment of fear passed like a cloud moving across the moon. 3 years ago she would have been inside by now, doors locked, curtains drawn, waiting for Robert to come home and tell her what kind of mood she should be in. Now she could sit on her own porch as long as she wanted, watching the stars come out one by one. Her phone buzzed with a text from Pamela, "Thinking about you tonight. Love you, sister." Denise smiled and texted back, "Love you too. And Pam? Thank you for believing me when I needed it most." "Always," came the immediate reply. As she got ready for bed, Denise caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked different than she had 3 years ago, stronger somehow, more solid. There were new lines around her eyes from laughing with her students. Her hair was longer now, and she'd let the gray streaks show instead of covering them up. This was what a woman looked like when she was truly free. Before she turned off the light, Denise said a prayer of thanks for the stranger who'd saved her life, for the sister who'd given her shelter, for the friends who'd helped her heal, and for the courage she'd found to start over. Tomorrow she would wake up in her own bed, in her own house, ready to live another day of the life she'd chosen. And that was the happiest ending she could have asked for.